So today, I want to share with you a few stories and one simple idea. When I was a boy growing up, every second summer break, my mother used to bring me back to visit my grandfather's home village in China. It was a beautiful rural fishing village on the coast of Fujian province. I remember one of the best things about going back was the food. Naturally, being a fishing village, the seafood was always amazing. The shrimp, the crabs, the fish, the oysters. And a couple of times a week, our family would prepare these amazing meals and invite our neighbors, relatives, and friends into our homes, and we would share these meals together. And this would happen throughout the village. Sometimes you would host, sometimes your neighbors would host. But almost every week, families would be sharing meals with neighbors in the village. And this sense of sharing applied to almost everything there. People would share their sewing machines when you needed to stitch your clothes. They would share their bicycles when you needed to reach the neighboring village. And they would share their boats if you needed to cross the river. People were connected by sharing. And that's the feeling I remember most about being in the village. That sense of connectedness and trust amongst strangers. Sharing was more than just about rationing limited resources. It was about opening the door to connect with others. Now fast forward to today, where we live in communities that no longer share. We seem to have lost that sense of sharing in our community because we can now afford to own the things that we need in our lives. We've become self-sufficient. Today, I live in Shanghai City. I don't own a car, but sometimes I want to use a car. And I walk down the street and I see all these cars parked along the road. And I think to myself, wouldn't it be nice if I could pick up one of these cars, drive it around for a couple of hours, and return it to its parking spot? Maybe leave a 50 on the dashboard with a note that says thank you. The idea I want to share with you today is about making that a reality. That idea that we don't need to own things to consume them. And that instead, by sharing, we can eliminate the waste in our cities and bring the connection back into our communities again. People are calling it the sharing economy and collaborative consumption. Let me tell you what it's all about. Fundamentally, we are creating internet-enabled marketplaces that allow people to use each other's things and to consume things which we don't own, but that we share with a community of people. Now, when I say that, you might say, we've seen that already 10 years ago with classified websites like Craigslist. But the platforms that are emerging today are going so far beyond. They're in the same verticals that Craigslist are in, but they are specialized marketplaces within these categories that are making shared consumption a reality. And there are now a whole host of sharing platforms that are exploding. People are beginning to use platforms to share cars on relay rides, clothes on 99 dresses, rides on Lyft and UberX, and home goods on Yodel. So here's the basic idea. For the past 60 years, our model of consumption has been individual. We choose what we want, influenced in part by advertising. If we want something, we go out, we buy it, and we own it to use it. And our access to things we want is governed by how much money we have or how much credit we can access. In the world of collaborative consumption that these verticals are moving towards, the idea is what we want is governed not by advertising, but our online community. Rather than owning assets, we will have shared access to things. The same asset is accessed by a number of different people. And your access to it is governed not by your credit rating, but by your reputation, how well you've used that asset. And as we transition from this individual to collaborative consumption model, the way production is organized may begin to slowly shift from institutions that employ thousands of people to platforms that employ fundamentally a handful of people, but that are connecting people who have an asset with people who need an asset. Platforms like this include Lending Club, which connects people who need to borrow money with people who are willing to lend it. Or Eat With and Kitchen Surfing, which connects people who want to share their cooking with people who are looking for a neighborhood dining experience. So this brings us to 3 key questions. The first is, how big is this idea? Well, here are some indicators. There are 80 million power drills in the US. Each power drill gets used, on average, 12 minutes in its lifetime. There are now 62 Lego bricks for every man, woman, and child on the planet. Over 7 million people have contributed to a Kickstarter. More than 2 million of them have contributed twice. And together, they have made over 18 million contributions. And finally, in its lifetime, the average car gets used 8% of the time. 92% of the time, it just sits there. So the second question is, what's changed? Since the idea of sharing is nothing new. The obvious change is technology. The internet and our phones are allowing us to access unutilized assets in a way that has become fast, cheap, and convenient. And that's creating demand for these platforms. On the supply side, individuals are finding that these platforms are becoming a valuable source of income. A yellow cab driver, for example, in New York makes on average $30,000 a year. The median income for an UberX driver in New York is $90,000 a year. Unlike traditional cab drivers, Uber drivers don't need to waste time circling blocks hoping to find a passenger. Less downtime means more fares and less wasted time. The second reason is a little more subtle, and that's trust. Technology has provided us with trust systems such as ratings and reviews of transactions and social network data that lets consumers know what services others have used and who is and isn't a trusted service provider. But I guess the most important question out of all this is, why should we even care? To do this, I want to tell you about 3 simple stories. The first story is about friendship. It's about a guy named Sebastian who lives in the UK. Sebastian owned an old bookstore in North London, but in 2010, he was having trouble keeping his bookstore open. And as a means to find income again, he began renting his home on Airbnb. In August 2011, the London riots broke out across the city and he was trapped inside his home. He was naturally very scared, and the next day, his mum calls him to see if he was okay. Thankfully, he was fine, and the property was undamaged. But here's the interesting thing. Between the time that the riots broke out and when his mum called, there was a 24-hour window. And in that period, 7 of his previous Airbnb guests called to see if he was okay. 7 of his Airbnb guests called him even before his own mother. Tonight, over 300,000 people will be staying in an Airbnb home. And if you include the hosts, that's about 500,000 people. They're going to come from over 190 different countries. That's every country in the world except Syria, Iran, North Korea, and Cuba. Never in human history have so many strangers been physically connected through one single platform. My second story is about cities. At the World Cup this year, there were 600,000 tourists from around the world that visited Brazil. Of those tourists, 120,000 of them stayed in an Airbnb home. The average host in Rio earned roughly $4,000 during the 1-month tournament, about 4 times the average monthly salary. Now, the backstory to this is that prior to the World Cup, the governments of Rio and Sao Paulo had reached out to Airbnb to help find ways of accommodating the influx of tourists. The cities had realized that it didn't make sense to build a massive hotels for a 1-in-50-year event. Governments around the world are beginning to realize that they can build more asset-efficient cities if they use sharing economy principles, because they can drive more consumption out of fewer assets. My final story is about community. It's about a platform called Good Gym, which was founded by a group of runners in the UK who wanted to find a better way to make use of their gym time and to connect with their community. The platform does a couple of things. The first is what they call missions, which allows people to post missions such as replacing a light bulb or delivering a medical transcription, because they don't have the ability to do so themselves. Good Gym runner accepts that mission, runs to the local pharmacy, delivers that prescription, and then runs back home. Simple. The second is what they call coaching runs. Your coach is an elderly person or a disabled person that's homebound, and once a week you agree with your coach to run to their house, bring a newspaper, share a cup of tea, have a chat, and go back home. That's it. Simple. But in this process, you may have been the only person that this person has seen all week. You've brought a ray of sunshine into their lives, and you've connected them to their community. What's interesting from a city perspective is that as Good Gym has grown, the National Healthcare Services in the UK has had two big realizations. The first is how many people in our cities are living isolated and disconnected from their communities. The second is how many of the dollars that we are spending on healthcare are actually being wasted. So today, the NHS and multiple city councils in the UK have partnered with Good Gym to help them rethink their healthcare delivery and social care needs. So I leave you with this. We've moved from a world of scarcity to a world of abundance. And in the process, we've lost our reliance on our community to access the things that we need. But in turn, we may have lost the one thing that is most important to us as human beings. And that's our sense of connection to each other and our sense of village. But I believe that we can change that. I believe that we can bring the village spirit back into our communities. By enabling platforms and technology that allow us to share again, we can build cities that are not just smarter and more efficient, but build cities that are more human and more connected. And I believe that's an idea worth sharing. Thank you.